Hey everyone, in this video I want us to look at the square root property. Square root property is just one of the methods that can be used to solve quadratic equations. Typically, this is a property that is used when we have a square term either isolated by itself already or one that we can easily isolate the square term, and I'll show you through some examples what I mean by that. Alright, so let's just look at an example. Let's say we want to solve the equation x squared is equal to 4. Well, we already have the square term isolated, so we're ready to go ahead and solve for the x. So we have that x squared, so we got to get rid of that square. So remember, what gets rid of a square is a square root. So we are ready to go ahead and take the square root of each side. A square and a square root cancel out, leaves us with just x. Now, because there is the possibility of there being two roots, a positive and a negative, when we use the square root property and we take the square root of the right side, we have to take the plus or minus of that square root. And so this will give us two answers. We will have plus or minus the square root of 4, which is 2. Which again, if we want to separate those answers, that's positive 2 and that's negative 2. All right, let's look at another example. Let's say we want to solve negative 3x squared plus 130 equals 22. So again, remember, we want to first get that square term isolated. So we're going to subtract the 130 from each side. It's going to cancel on the left, leaves us with just the negative 3x squared. And then 22 minus 130, that gives me negative 108. Now divide each side by that negative 3. That leaves us with x squared equals 36. Now we're ready to take the square root of each side. That leaves me with just x. Now remember, we take using the square root property, when we take the square root of the right side, that gives me plus or minus the square root of that 36, which gives us x equals plus or minus 6. And again, remember, that represents our two answers. All right, looking at another one. Let's say we want to solve 3x squared minus 183 equals 9. Well, we can add 183 each side to isolate that squared term. That leaves me with 3x squared equals 192. Divide each side by 3. And that leaves me with x squared equals 64. Now we have that square term isolated, so we are ready to take the square root of each side. A square and a square root cancel, leaves me with just x. Remember, this is plus or minus that square root of 64, and the square root of 64 is 8, so that gives me my two answers of positive 8 and negative 8. All right, very good. So now let's look and see what happens when we have a trinomial, what we're trying to solve. Let's say we're trying to solve x squared plus 16x plus 60 equals 0. Okay, the method we're actually going to do here is something called completing the square. Completing the square. So when we have this squared term with the x and then the x by itself in the middle, we can't just isolate the square term and use the square root property. We have to first do something called completing the square. So the way completing the square works is we first want to get the x terms on one side by themselves, any constant terms on the other side. So first thing I need to do is I need to move the 60 to the other side. So we're going to subtract it from each side. That leaves me with x squared plus 16x equals negative 60. Now, once we have that x terms on one side by itself, what we are going to do is we're going to take the b term, divide that by 2, and then square it. Okay, and if you don't remember where that comes from, Remember, the standard form for a quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So the b term is the number in front of the x. So in this case, it's the 16. So we're going to take 16, divide it by 2, and then square that. Okay, so 16 divided by 2 is 8. And then if we had 8 squared, that's 64. So what we're going to do with that value now is we're going to add it to each side. So we're going to add 64 to the left side. We're going to add 64 to the right side. Now, if we think it back to factoring, this left side now, once we've added that 64 to that left side, we should have created a perfect square trinomial. And so we can actually now take this trinomial and factor it into a binomial of x plus 8 squared. All right, and if we was to fold that out to check it, we would see it would take us back to that previous trinomial. And then on the right side, negative 60 plus 64, well, that is positive 4. So that is completing the square. That is taking a trinomial and turning it into a form of the same equation that now we can apply the square root property on. If we look at this left side, we have that square term isolated. So from here, we are ready to take the square root of each side. Again, a square root and a square cancel leaves me with just the x plus 8. The right side, we take the square root. Remember, we still have the plus or minus square root of 4. Square root of 4 is 2, so that is x plus 8 equals plus or minus 2. Now, we are not done because we don't have the x solved for. So actually, now that we have the plus or minus 2, that's going to separate my two answers. We have x plus 8 equals a positive 2. We have x plus 8 equals a negative 2. Okay. Now, if we solve each one of these, subtract 8, subtract 8, here we get x equals negative 6. And then on this side, subtract 8, subtract 8, we get x equals negative 10. And there's my two answers. So when you have a trinomial, we first have to complete the square, get it into a square term that we can then apply the perfect square trinomial to. So this is using the square root property and completing the square to be able to use the square root property.